Hi everyone, and welcome to the last part of our video series of Biblical Archaeology. And in this fourth and final part, we are going to be looking at Biblical Archaeology in the New Testament. Again, as I've said in previous videos, this is by no means exhaustive. This is just a small sample of the evidence that's out there. So, having said that, let's get started with some really cool artifacts. Now, in Acts 13, Paul, when he arrives on the island of Cyprus, he meets a Roman proconsul, which is a Roman governor, by the name of Sergius Paulus, who had converted to Christianity after witnessing different miracles, and he heard the gospel. Now, what you see here on this stone tablet is an inscription Roman inscription with his name on it, with Sergius Paulus's name on it. We have found a lot of artifacts, actually, with his name on it. He's a famous proconsul from that area. He seemed to be a pretty decent guy, and then he became a Christian, according to Luke in the book of Acts. And what you have here is on this tablet, which would have been probably about 7 or 10 years after he met Paul in Acts 13, in 54 AD, which is when this was being chiseled. We know it's from 54 AD because it tells us in the 13th year of Claudius, which Claudius became the emperor of Rome in 41 AD. So, just simple math, 41 plus 13. So just really cool. Here we can see him being spoken of both in the Bible and by Roman history. Awesome, more awesome than just that. We basically found the rock that was in front of his property, in front of his house, that had his family name on it for the area in which he lived. A lot of families do this today. I know that I have my family name out in front of our house by our mailbox. So lots of places do that then, and they do it now. And we found the rock for his property, for his estate, which has, again, the family name on it. So pretty cool. Moving to another proconsul from the time of Paul, who was not a nice guy. He's probably what you would call a career politician. In these inscriptions that we found at Delphi in the early 1900s, again, it's another decree given by Caesar Claudius to a man by the name of Gallio, who the Bible does talk about here in a second. He's being promoted to his, I think, 15th term as proconsul. So this guy's a career politician. He's probably a really slimy guy, blows whichever way the wind blows. History changes a little, but humans never really change much, and God knows politicians never change. They're corrupt then, they're corrupt now. Ugh. However, what is so cool about this is that Claudius, again, tells us that, in the reign in which this happened, we know so clearly this is such an amazing piece of discovery that we know that this promotion for Gallio happens in the spring of 52 AD. That is utterly amazing and extremely valuable because now we have a concrete reference point for Paul's life, both before and after Acts 18. Because in Acts 18, it tells us that Paul, who was in Corinth, there was a conflict between him and some of the Jews, and the Jews arrest him and they take him to Gallio. And Luke tells us that Gallio was made, the proconsul of Achaia being the area around Greece. And so Galileo, a career politician, he's like, I don't care about your religious squabbles. Go away. I'm too busy enjoying my own political life. So here in Acts 18, it matches the history, right, from this stone. It tells us that we have now a very clear date when we can take Paul's life before and after Acts 18. Acts 18 becomes a milestone marker, a linchpin for the life of Paul. From the life of Paul, we can calculate so many other events from his life, all from this tablet here, talking about the promotion of Gallio, a man who, from all accounts, wasn't very useful to anyone except himself. Speaking of Corinth, in 1929, they found this really awesome tablet inscription of kind of a commencement plaque dating from the 1st century, and it says basically in Latin, Greek, Latin, that here this is for Erastus, okay? who was basically in charge of public works and maintenance. He's basically like a city planner. And that he laid concrete at his own expense. Okay, this guy has to be a Christian, because there's no way that a government worker is going to do this out of his own money, out of his own pocket, right? How do city officials pay for anything today? With your tax dollars, not with their dollars. But here is Erastus, this city planner, who's paying for it himself. How crazy awesome is that? And what does the Bible tell us? The Bible tells us that in Rome, there was a man who Paul mentions by name in Romans 16, who is the name of Erastus. He was the director of public works. Okay? And then about a decade and a half later, when Paul's writing his last letter of his life in the Bible, it tells us that Erastus had moved from Rome to Corinth. So here's this famous city planner who does a pretty good job in Rome. So he goes off to modernize Corinth, to turn their dirt roads into paved roads, as it were. Okay, guys, this has to be probably my favorite discovery. I'm not going to lie. I probably love this one most. Of everything we've talked about in all 4 videos, I'm utterly fascinated by this. I mean, even more so than the attacking little tank battle ram thing that we saw back in a few videos ago. This is utterly amazing. This was discovered in Nazareth in 1870s. Again, a decree issued by Caesar Claudius, probably written right when he came into power around 41 AD. And it makes it a penalty to steal or to move bodies from tombs without consent. Such a strange decree, okay? Because think about it. Throughout history, even today, with most grave robbers don't steal bodies. They steal the treasure and the gold that's with the bodies, right? This is why we have hundreds of Egyptian mummies, but not very many of the artifacts they were buried with. This is what made King Tut so famous. No grave robber, no tomb raider had ever found his cemetery area before, had ever found his little catacomb before, until they found it there in 1920s. Like, that's what made him so famous, was that all the treasure was intact. And yet here we have a new law being written. If you steal a body, you will die. That's crazy. And yet, what does the Bible say? It says that after Jesus resurrected from the grave, that the chief priests and the Roman soldiers who were paid by the chief priests, they lied to Pilate. And they said, oh, his disciples came and stole the body while we were asleep. So the way that the Jews and the Romans tried to explain away the resurrection was to say that his disciples stole the body. And now here we have an inscription put in Jesus' hometown, mind you, that if you steal a body, it's a crime punishable by death. So Dr. Clyde Billington, who's probably done the most study on this, a few years ago in a magazine that he wrote, Archaeology magazine called Artifact, he summarized the Nazareth inscription this way. He said, quote, "The context of the Nazareth inscription clearly proves that it was written for Jews, not Gentiles, and that it was certainly issued by Claudius in response to the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. It is highly likely that the inscription was inscribed in 41 AD at the instigation of King Herod Agrippa I." So think about that, guys. Here's Agrippa. He's probably just killed James. He's trying to probably arrest and kill other Christians and apostles. And the last thing he wants is more so-called resurrections, right? So he writes a letter to Claudius, the new emperor, and said, hey, this Jesus guy, they faked his resurrection, and I don't want them faking I don't want his apostles faking their resurrections or other Christians faking. We don't need any more resurrection faking. Make it a death penalty. Anyone who steals a body will themselves be a dead body. And Claudius acquiesces and does this. So that's crazy. So here you have indirectly, in a lot of ways, you have proof that they're trying to explain away the resurrection. They're writing laws to indirectly kind of deal with the fallout from the resurrection of Christ. So here you have a really cool kind of proof in Jesus' hometown, showing you that the resurrection happened and the Roman and the Jewish leadership is trying to, do damage control on it. That's so neat. I'm utterly fascinated by this. Speaking of death penalties, in front of the temple, as you may know, around the entrances of the Jewish temple, it was illegal for any Gentile to go in. They could go into the court of Gentiles, or in the women, but Jewish women and Gentiles, men and women, could not enter the temple. If you did, there was this warning sign there basically saying, if you, a non-Jewish man, enter, we're going to kill you. We will drag you out of the city, outside of the temple, and we will just stone you to death. Here's kind of a cleaner version of the same kind of sign from 17 AD, guys. That means Jesus and the apostles going in and out of the temple 3 times a year at least would have seen this sign, all right? You're looking at something that Jesus and the apostles and the early Christians of that era would have saw for themselves. And if they're like me, when I see something, I want to touch it. So it wouldn't surprise me if they touch this or one of the other signs, man. It's there. And this is so cool that you're looking at something on this screen that the people living in Jerusalem in the first century, that the people of the New Testament, that the apostles, that Jesus himself would have seen and read as they went in and out of the temple. What it fully says is basically this, that no foreigner can enter the balustrade in the sanctuary in the enclosure. So basically you can't go into the temple. Whoever is caught, on him shall be put blame for the death which is about to ensue. Right? You see this in Acts, right? Some Jews lied and said Paul brought a Gentile into the temple, and so they were ready to kill and stone Paul, like right there on the spot. If Roman soldiers hadn't showed up to save Paul's life, he would have died like right there on the spot. It's just crazy to think about, but just so neat of its implication, you guys. Here's this other famous discovery. Speaking of the temple, this was discovered in 2009 in the city of Magdala, or the ruins of Magdala today. The famous, obviously, Mary Magdalene. She's from the town of Magdala. And this obviously dates from before 70 AD because it's a model. It's a replica with some artistic creativity on top of the temple. Here's like a little working model of the temple. Okay, you can see on the sides it has arches on the sides and on the back. On the top of it, it has flowers, it has trees, and no, those aren't like hearts. Those aren't Greek hearts. That's the showbread. That's the bread being opened and torn, like the bread being broken in half. And most likely what this is, this would not have been the roof of the temple, but this was probably the table of showbread. So he's taking the table of showbread and he's making it the roof of the temple. Again, that artistic license of combining different things about the holy sacredness of it. And again, you can see the different arches. And the front of it is so amazing, guys. Like, if you can imagine, like, opening the doors and looking into the temple, looking into the holy place, this is likely what you would have saw according to this model. You would have seen the pillars on the side. You would have seen 2 water jars beside that, 2 jars, one filled with water, one filled with oil for all the different ritual cleansing parts. You would have had the table of incense, and then on top of the table of altar of incense, you would have had a menorah, a 7-branched menorah, okay? This is the oldest depiction of a 7-branch menorah for starters, but also just validates Jewish history, okay? Because according to Jewish history, you could have 8-stick and 9-stick menorahs out of the temple, but in the temple you could only use 7. You cannot use 7 out of the temple. You could only use a 7-branch menorah in the temple, which again, it's 7. It's, and you know how important that number is to the Jewish people. So just really awesome discovery that was made just about a decade and change ago. And now let's turn our attentions to some really awesome discoveries about people who either had a hand in trying to kill Jesus or did kill Jesus, as it were. Now, there was a time when some people didn't even believe that Pontius Pilate was a real person. Some scholars, some German skeptics back in the day, during the so-called Enlightenment, were making that argument. And then we found this wonderful piece of archaeology, guys. It basically says on it, it was a piece of a building, and it says, from Latin, translated into English for you, it says Tiberius, who would have been the emperor during the time of Christ, Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, military governor, right? Prefect of Judea. And here you have proof that Pontius Pilate was a real historical person, all right? The authors of the New Testament weren't just making up history, okay? Here we have concrete proof that Pilate was a real person. And does this match the Bible? Yeah, almost verbatim. Luke 3:1 tells us that in the 15th year, during the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being the governor of Judea. So, almost a verbatim quote. Luke just gives you a little extra information about how long Tiberius had been in reign when Pilate became the governor. So just really cool, guys. Now, let's back up in time just a wee bit, about 30 years or so, to the time when of King Herod. King Herod, this particular Herod is the one who tried to kill Jesus after he was born. He's the one who went on the infanticide, genocide, is the word, there in Bethlehem. And they finally found his body. At Masada in 2007. Herod's fortress was called the Herodium. He was buried there. His bones were there. They put it into his ossuary. Ossuary is the box where they would put the bones after you the flesh and skin and all that decayed. And then they'd put your bones in a box per typical Jewish ritual. Well, many Jews were hiding up there in Masada from the Romans right around the time of the temple destruction. And most likely what occurred is how much they hated Herod, how much they hated all the Herods, but particularly this Herod because he was such a close friend to Rome, they probably smashed his ossuary. And here's what remains of his ossuary today. Did Lord knows what to his bones, but here you can see just what's left of such an evil man, or at least what's left of his ossuary. Now, speaking of ossuaries, let's talk about one that actually is intact. Very rich, very ornate. You can see there even on the screen. It's pretty fancy. You had to have some money to build this, right? And what this is the ossuary, the resting place for the bones of Caiaphas, the high priest who found Jesus guilty and handed him over to the Romans to be killed. Now, inside this box, as was very common back in the day, you'd put family members, husband, wives, kids. But one of the skeletons inside this box clearly belonged to that of an old man, at least in his 60s, okay? That combined with the ornateness of the box and the inscription here on the side, which literally reads in Aramaic, Joseph, son of Caiaphas. Okay. Now, again, going back to our Roman Jewish historian Josephus from the 1st century, he tells us that Caiaphas's real name, his birth name, if you will, was Joseph. So Joseph Caiaphas, who's in charge of the priesthood. So the bones inside here, like this is the resting place of the guy who handed over Jesus to be killed. Like, he's there, you guys. He's a real person. The guy who condemned Jesus to die, he died himself. And here's the box where his remains were kept for centuries. So amazing, guys. So amazing. Speaking of crucifixion, this discovery was made a few years ago. And it is as disgusting as it looks, it is the foot of a crucified man who lived in the 1st century. For whatever reason, they left the nail in his foot. But as gruesome as it is, it also shows us some really important facts. That when they drove the spike and the nail through your foot and hands, they would take a hammer and bang the back of it, creating kind of a hook, right? You can see the hook there. So that, I don't know how you could do this through the pain and not pass out, but so you wouldn't try to pull the nails out of the wood or out of your feet. Like, they ensured that those nails were staying in place and you were staying in place. You would not get off that cross on your own power. It's just horrible and gruesome, but also really fascinating. So let's wrap this up, you guys. What is probably the biggest discovery ever made in Bible archaeology, Old and New Testament? What is the most important discovery that has ever been made so far in Bible archaeology? It has to be the Dead Sea Scrolls, you guys. They were found in 1947 by a little shepherd boy just playing in the caves down by the Dead Sea, threw some rocks into a cave and heard a sound of pottery smash. He looked inside and he found broken pottery and a scroll. And most of these scrolls are from around 200 BC, probably put there by the Essenes, a group of people who lived out in the middle of nowhere in the Dead Sea area. And they just found all of these jars. They literally found every book of the Old Testament except Esther. And they even found multiple copies of other, like Isaiah, for example. Some of the scrolls were in great condition. Some of them were in not so great condition, but still legible. We could literally just spend hours talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls, you guys. They are incredible. As you can imagine, scholars have been studying them for 80 years. They're no end of fascination. They're even used today when translating Bibles. They're one of the resources that modern-day Bible translators use when translating Bibles, particularly difficult passages. They use to see the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint and other things like that. Why are these such a big deal? Because what's been the biggest criticism of the Bible for centuries, for thousands of years? Right, the Bible is the ultimate game of telephone. The Bible that we have today isn't the same Bible that Jesus had, the Old Testament that is. Isn't the same Old Testament that Jesus had when he was alive. It's not the same Old Testament that they had when Daniel or Jeremiah were alive, or when David was alive, or at least as much of it as they had when David was alive. It was still being written when he was around. But that's been the argument, right? It's the ultimate game of telephone, and there's been so many changes and so many distortions. The Bible's not even reliable, blah, 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 blah. And yet, when they found the Dead Sea Scrolls in the 1940s and started studying them, and then in the 1950s, when they're like, oh my gosh, the words on these scrolls are the exact same words in the Bible today. You can literally go to the Dead Sea Scroll Museum, all right? You can find the great scroll of Isaiah. It's on display. Its display case is in the shape of a scroll wheel. You can go and read it. If you learn some Hebrew, you can go and locate yourself where Isaiah 53 is on that scroll, and you can start reading it in Hebrew. And then you can pull up your phone and look up Isaiah 53, and you'll notice, oh my gosh, they match. I can literally read the Hebrew from 2,200 years ago, Aramaic, and I can be like, wow, Isaiah has not changed. Isaiah 53, arguably the most important prophecy about Jesus in the Old Testament, has not changed. It's still there, guys. You can go and read it, at least the replica of it, for yourselves. There it is. So here's the conclusion of the matter from all 4 videos. Let's bring this baby home, guys. Let's land the plane. Number 1, as I said in my first video, does archaeology confirm these things? Yes, archaeology does confirm the historicity of many of the ancient peoples and places and events in the Bible. Number 2, for the last 160 years, since the mid-1800s, across the Holy Land, so many discoveries have been made that shed light on how the ancient world lived to better help us understand the Bible, right? The Bible just records things that were written, okay? The Bible doesn't explain every detail about how things worked and why. Why? Because when the authors of the Bible were writing those things, the people who were alive and reading it at first knew all of the extra context, so they didn't have to mention it, okay? But here, 2,000 years removed and, a whole ocean and a half away in America, we need that archaeology work to kind of fill in the details that have fallen in between the cracks over these last 2,000-3,000 years of history. And archaeology, particularly in the last 150 some years, has done that. It's so awesome and helpful. And finally, look, it comes down to this. If you can trust the Bible historically, then you can trust the Bible spiritually. The story of Jesus' birth, his life, his death, and most importantly, his resurrection, they are true. How much more evidence do you need? What is keeping you from believing? Have you put your faith in Christ? And if not, why not? What's keeping you from that? I hope you enjoyed this series. I know I have. If you have any questions, just ask them in the comment section below, and I'll do my best perhaps to try to answer some of them. I hope you guys have a wonderful day, and that this series, these 4 videos, were a blessing to you and your faith in helping to build up your apologetics from an archaeological point of view. Thank you.